All right. And so we're starting. So good afternoon. Welcome to our WES Lunch and Learn series. Hopefully folks have been to these before. These evolved as a way for WES Advisory Committee members and WES staff to get better acquainted and learn about specific topics that impact or relate to WES. So of course, this is a lunch and learn. These are meant to be fun and informal. Please feel free to prepare your lunch, eat your lunch, keep your camera on, keep your camera off. It's all okay by us. Our only request is that you do mute yourself unless you're speaking or asking a question, just to help keep things moving. My name is Christopher Bowker. I'm a member of the advisory committee, and together with Chris Kuntz, we'll help facilitate today's session. Our goal is to provide about a 30 to 40-minute presentation, leave room for questions towards the end, as well as for discussion, and get you back to your day by 1 p.m. Today's topic is on the findings of fish habitat and abundance surveys at WES's Carly Creek Water Quality and Restoration Project by fish biologist Todd Alsbury. Todd is a professional fish biologist and owner of Altap Restoration, LLC. Prior to starting Altap Restoration, Todd was the district fish biologist for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, where he managed regionally important fisheries in the Sandy, Clackamas, Malala, and Lower Willamette Rivers from 2005 to 2019. Currently, his environmental consulting work focuses on assisting local watershed councils and their partners by conducting habitat surveys, water quality monitoring, and habitat restoration that supports native fish recovery in the region. And I will mention, so Todd's preference is that if you do have a quick question or a clarification on the slides or the content, I think he's okay with getting those questions. Feel free just to raise your hand. If you put something in the chat, Chris or I can raise that or bring that up. If you've got a question that's more substantial, please save that for the end, just so we can kind of keep our cadence moving forward. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to you, Todd.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Let me pull up my notes real quick. All right, thank you, Chris. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you today. First, I want to give you some background on fish in the Clackamas population. It's kind of interesting to see so many of you that I know well and have probably presented to or worked with in the past. So it's really nice to see you all and have this opportunity. First, I want to give you some background on fish in the Clackamas population. And when I say the Clackamas population, I'm referring to a group of watersheds that make up an area where salmon and steelhead are closely related, and they regularly mix by straying within adjacent water bodies. So the Clackamas population itself is listed under the Endangered Species Act as threatened. And with that, it's not just the Clackamas River, it's the adjacent tributaries, Abernathy Creek, Kellogg Mount Scott Creek, Johnson Creek, and the other small tributaries in the urban area that make up this population area. And I'll kind of refer to that a little bit later as to what spatial structure means and how significant it is for the lower basin tributaries. I'll talk a little bit about basic fish life history, their distribution, and the factors that limit their survival. Then I'll talk about how fish use the Clackamas watershed proper. This will be put into the context of how fish use the lower basin tributaries throughout the population area, and also how they contribute to overall population health. Then to finish, I'll go over the results of a study looking at how habitat restoration actions conducted in Carly Creek in 2018 are contributing to that overall population health. Okay, next slide. There are several species of salmon and trout present within the Clackamas population area. There's coho salmon, fall and spring Chinook salmon. They're both the same species, but their run timings differ between fall and spring. There's chum salmon that are no longer present. They were extirpated years ago. Both are basically, their population dwindled to zero, both from overharvest, but also habitat degradation. There's winter steelhead, also known as rainbow trout. The rainbow trout are a resident form. Winter steelhead are the anadromous or ocean-going form. There's also cutthroat trout and bull trout. Those are fish that aren't included in the Clackamas population, but I wanted to have them on this list because they're very important and bull trout are listed, but they're not, again, in the population. Collectively, these are all called salmonids, and I may refer to them as salmonids later in the presentation. All of these fish are very migratory, both as adults and juveniles, either within the watershed that they are born or as they migrate out to the ocean. Juvenile salmon and steelhead may spend up to 3 years rearing in the Clackamas Basin and tributaries before migrating to the ocean. This means they may be exposed to pretty harsh conditions in freshwater areas during summer months and at the lower elevations where we don't have snow to provide cooler flows to the streams. And when I say this, consider the summer of 2020 when air temperature exceeded 100 degrees for several days in the Portland metro area. We don't know exactly how warm these urban tributaries got, but they likely exceeded 80 degrees. And if fish didn't have refuge to seek cooler water, they likely would not survive. Salmon and steelhead spend 1 to 5 years in the ocean before returning to their natal stream to spawn. So they may migrate hundreds, even thousands of miles out in the Pacific or into the Gulf of Alaska as they grow and mature. Then they'll return as a mature adult to find suitable spawning areas that are throughout the population area where conditions allow. And that is clean gravel, water temperature typically less than 55 degrees, overhead cover, and several other factors that I won't kind of belabor you with today. But this is a map that you may all be familiar with. It shows the West service area and how we are located at the confluence of 2 major river systems. The Clackamas River coming in right at Gladstone, and then the Willamette River coming in with its confluence at the Clackamas right in the Westland, Oregon City, and Gladstone area. There are other tributaries that also flow through the West service area. There's Abernathy Creek that flows kind of to the southwest of Oregon City and then comes through Oregon City and empties into the Willamette at Highway 99E. What I'm not going to talk about today are other factors that are limiting fish productivity and recovery, although I do want to acknowledge these factors, which include fish harvest. So the fish returning to this population are on occasion removed by either commercial or sport fisheries, and also fish hatcheries, because the fish hatcheries in the past particularly have had an influence on our populations by sometimes creating negative interactions between wild and hatchery fish. Okay, next slide. So the other native fish that are also in the Clackamas River, these are the less glamorous species, the lampreys. There's Pacific lamprey and river brook lamprey. What's interesting about these fish, they spawn in the late spring, but they rear in fine sediment compared to other fish species that are in the water column and are subject to impacts from fine sediments. Lamprey can actually benefit from a moderate amount of fine sediment, not excess fine sediment, but they actually use that to rear for several years before they emerge, and then in the case of Pacific lamprey, migrate to the ocean. The Clackamas population area is very important for lamprey, and one reason is due to its proximity to Willamette Falls. Willamette Falls does act as somewhat of a barrier to lamprey, in particular now because of the dam that is on the top of the falls, but passageways have been created for them. Again, the less glamorous fish, the large-scale sucker, mountain whitefish, sculpin, dace, shiners, and other native minnow species. I do want to acknowledge that there are non-native fish species that are impacting the local area. There's bass, crappie, bluegill, weatherfish that are exotic aquarium fish, as well as goldfish. The conditions are becoming more suitable as the waters warm in the area. This is particularly in the Willamette and Columbia rivers. All right, next slide. Past timber practices and development within the riparian corridor significantly impacts the stream as well as the riparian corridor. There's less wood that can naturally fall into the stream. This would provide stability to the stream channel and also provides complex hiding areas for these very small fish that are rearing before they go to the ocean. Shade is reduced, leading to increases in temperature, and the lack of shade allows non-native species like blackberry and knotweed to thrive. In addition, the riparian corridor can't provide the filtering mechanism once provided by a healthy riparian area, overall leading to reduced water quality. Next slide. One example of this in this area is Beaver Lake and its influence on water temperature in Abernathy Creek. The graph that's shown here shows in blue Abernathy Creek upstream of Beaver Lake in light blue, and then in dark blue it is Abernathy Creek downstream of the lake. And in the middle of summer, it actually increases temperature over 13 degrees. So that's a significant impact to the ability for fish to rear, since water temperature that exceeds 75 degrees can be lethal if, again, those fish can't find cooler refuge to rear in. Next slide. Another factor limiting production and survival of fish is fine sediment. This is contributed by roads, agricultural areas, development along stream, and landslides that are both natural and human induced. This impacts gravel quality and the opportunity of fish to spawn. It reduces the size of pools that are critical for juvenile fish rearing, and it impacts aquatic insects that occupy the stream bed for portions of their life cycle, since sediment doesn't allow them to access food or filter feed. And when the aquatic insects are impacted, you've basically impacted the primary food source for your juvenile fish. Next slide. Fish barriers, a very big issue in urban areas. On smaller streams in the population area can restrict access to large portions of the watershed. The Highway 99E culvert at the mouth of Abernathy Creek is one of those. It's been retrofit in the past by ODOT, so it does pass fish, but it needs to be maintained in order to make sure that fish can continue to pass. The Highway 99E culvert at the mouth of Kellogg Creek is another one that for years has limited access to the entire watershed in Kellogg and Mount Scott. Fortunately, there is a design process underway with replacement funding nearly secured to do something about this very significant barrier in the service area. Road culverts on smaller tributaries can limit access to the critical cool water refuge that, again, is becoming more and more important as the rivers and streams warm as the climate warms. Most of these barriers remaining are on smaller streams in the developing and urban area that in many cases are blocking access to refuge habitat. The barriers on Kellogg and Abernathy are partially block over 10 miles of spawning and rearing habitat. When we talk about barriers, again, there are hundreds of road culverts or other barriers that limit access throughout the Portland kind of metro region. Many of those aren't on within the habitat range of salmon and steelhead, but they do limit access of, say, resident trout or other species that are migratory at the upper reaches of those streams. Next slide. So where is the good news? Well, the current habitat conditions in the upper Clackamas and the tributaries does support native fish production. The Clackamas River salmon and steelhead runs are nearing record numbers. Restoration actions are underway or planned for the near future to restore degraded conditions. And the Clackamas Partnership is leading the effort to restore critical habitats needed by fish to survive. Next slide. Here. When looking at the Clackamas River population area and the Clackamas River in particular, we must consider the dams in the area and how they've impacted fish in the past and continue to this day. The River Mill Dam was actually constructed in the early 1900s. With that, there was a fish ladder that was constructed that helped fish to get past this dam. Unfortunately, that fish ladder failed in, I think, 1906. So for 10 years, passage was actually restricted in the upper portion of this watershed. So you can imagine the impacts that occurred very early on to the population from this type of a thing occurring. So the basin has had a challenge ever since these dams were constructed. These dams and culverts and other stream crossings create challenges for fish migrating up and downstream in the basin. Adults migrating upstream at the dams may be blocked, delayed, or injured, and the juveniles migrating downstream may be seasonally blocked, delayed, injured, or even killed. PGE initiated measures to reduce these impacts beginning in 2006 and signed a new license to operate the Clackamas project in 2010. These measures include a new fish ladder at River Mill Dam. The former ladder was known as one of the worst in the Pacific Northwest due to its age and size, and it just had a hard time passing fish effectively upstream. There's also a floating surface collector upstream of River Mill and North Fork Dam to safely move fish around the dams. There's a flow diversion structure in Faraday Lake to reduce the residence time of water in the reservoir and reduce the temperatures coming out of that reservoir. And the local groups are working to improve passage and other barriers to migration throughout the population area. And again, this is our watershed councils, the Clackamas River Basin Council, North Clackamas Watershed Council, Greater Oregon City, and Johnson Creek Watershed Councils. Want to make sure that they get their respect and their recognition for what they do. On the top left, again, is a photo of Faraday Lake, and you can kind of see two parallel lines running through the lake. And what that does is it just increases the rate at which water moves through the lake. And it actually decreases temperature in the river downstream about 1/2 degree. So it is significant in its contribution. On the top right is the North Fork Juvenile Fish Collector. And what this device, it's actually a very large structure upstream of the dam, is it takes in about 2,000 cubic feet per second of water and filters the fish out of that water, so they're not forced to either go over the dam or through the turbines, which is not a very efficient or high survival way to move downstream. So now these upgrades have significantly improved survival, which is leading to far more juvenile fish migrating downstream and using the lower basin to grow and prepare for ocean migration. Next slide. So the Clackamas River is one of the most productive rivers in Oregon. The fish runs are increasing in abundance. PG's actions are working and the numbers do prove it. The Clackamas Partnership's restoration work, including removing barriers, improving riparian conditions, and increasing the amount of quality rearing habitat, is working. The actions are beginning to take hold and produce results. But what I'm kind of here to talk about today is what is the role of the lower basin in the more urban or developed tributaries like Carly Creek, and what do they play in what role do they play in population recovery? Well, they provide critical rearing habitat for juvenile fish migrating from primary spawning areas upstream. There's limited spawning opportunity in some of these urban tributaries, and that's in large part due to the development along the riparian area, barriers to migration, or the condition of the riparian area. But again, they still play an important role in population health. When we talk about population health, there's 4 categories we kind of like to refer to. I'm not going to go over them in detail because it's, again, another class in biology, I guess. But the first three of these are kind of self-explanatory. As the more productive a population is, the more fish it produces, the better it survives, and the more abundant it is, typically it's healthier. The one factor I want to focus on here, though, is spatial structure. And spatial structure is how fish are distributed within the population area, in that the more widely distributed populations that occupy all available habitat have a greater chance of making it if some catastrophe happens. We all know Mount Hood is a volcano, and as such, we hope it doesn't happen or explode, but at some point it most likely will. And if we compare it to what happened back in 1980 when Mount St. Helens erupted, all streams flowing off of Mount St. Helens were almost completely void of fish after the eruption for many years. The local populations of fish survived using the Green River, which is a tributary of the Toutle River off of Mount St. Helens, and other tributaries that remain clear despite the eruption. So these tributaries coming off of Mount Hood could be impacted, say the volcano were to explode, whereas the lower basin tributaries and areas that may not get those impacts would buoy the population in the future. Next slide. Okay, this is a poor map of showing where Carly Creek is in the overall watershed, but it also shows the position of the dams in the watershed. Right in the middle of the drawing is the town of Estacada, and that's where the primary dams on the Clackamas are. There's two others, one at Harriet Lake and one at Timothy Lake, that are outside of the distribution of salmon and steelhead. But this provides you an opportunity to see how much of the river is upstream of those dams and how much production does occur up there. Next slide. All right, so this is a total number of salmon and steelhead returning to the Clackamas upstream of North Fork Dam. This doesn't include the lower basin and tributaries, but PGE has a counting station at or just below North Fork Dam, which gives them the ability to count these fish. So you can see with their passage improvements, they actually did one in 2006 with the Rivermill Dam, but most of these juvenile passage improvements occurred in 2012 to 15, but they are really producing results in terms of the number of adult fish returning to the basin. What's even more impressive is the number of juvenile fish that are coming out of the upper basin. And in years past, we were seeing maybe 50 to 100,000 juvenile fish being counted. Now there's over 1 million combined juvenile fish coming out of the upper basin. And in some cases, this is a survival, thing where more fish are surviving to be able to migrate down into the lower basin. But the other is that in the past, the dams actually forced fish to hold back when they may have wanted to migrate downstream. Now fish are allowed to migrate on their own volitionally when they choose to and not when they're forced. So it allows fish, again, the best opportunity to migrate when they want to, when they need to. Okay, next slide. Now we'll talk about the more specifics of the Carly Creek project and the results of a study that I conducted looking at how both habitat and fish use changed since the project was implemented in 2018. All right, next slide. This is an opportunity to also show some aerial photos that I was able to collect off of Google Earth. And this shows an aerial image prior to the project being implemented. In 2017, you can see an open, formerly farmed field that likely contributed either fine sediments to the stream or simply just prevented growth of native vegetation that would have otherwise protected the riparian area of the stream, but that was no longer present. So in 2018, next slide, Wes took advantage of the opportunity of looking at Carly Creek, which is surrounded by industrial development that continues today. They realized this and looked at ways to reduce the impacts of development on Carly Creek and the lower Clackamas River. So in 2018, they initiated the project to reduce the impacts of stormwater on these developed and developing areas in the watershed. Next slide. Okay, this is showing the constructed water treatment wetlands. You can kind of see the treatment wetlands are the lighter green. That's, I believe, an algae growing on the surface in the middle of summer. But you can see the site starting to grow up as we progress through these photos. So next slide, 2020. Again, you can see more of the native vegetation starting to grow up. This isn't a good view. I'll show you one more view at the end that shows a better view of vegetation growth, but go ahead and go to the next slide, 2021. And you can just continue to see how things are beginning to occur, in this area, both in terms of increasing the amount of open water habitat, and this becomes more evident in the next 2 years. Go ahead and move to 2022. And even 2023, there is a new beaver dam that's been constructed in the main channel of Carly Creek, and it increased the pool. It actually doubled the amount of pool habitat that was present. So that's very significant for rearing juvenile fish. Okay, go ahead, next slide. This is 2024. This photo was taken in the middle of winter, so not a lot of leaves on the trees. But one thing I would point out, if you look at the top of the photo where the stream channel is, you can see the wood that has been placed in the channel. It's maybe had a better view that I could have shown you, but from prior to doing this project, there was almost no wood in the channel, and now we have many pieces, and I'll show you another photo of this in a moment. Okay, next slide. Okay, this shows a shot more recently that shows the vegetation growing up around the wetland complex and the stream channel that is flowing kind of mid-right to your of the photo. All right, next slide. Results of the study. Prior to the project, the Carly Creek channel was simple, straight, and it lacked overhead cover. This is the photo looking down on it, where if you look at the stream channel, there's just no wood. It is completely void. Substrate was high and fine sediment, which is typical of urban streams. Oftentimes, urban streams that have high levels of impervious surface, you get a lot of erosion when you do have those peak flow events. There's very low levels of large wood. We're talking about large wood that is greater than 8 inches in diameter and 20 feet long. But even then, there was very little prior to the project. And before the project, it was documented that there is a barrier to passage of fish at an abandoned road crossing that is apparently no longer used. Next slide. Rather than show you the tables of data from the report, I wanted to show some pictures and provide the take-home messages from the study. One thing to consider is that changes post-restoration can take years to take hold and provide the intended benefits. So 5 years is not really long enough to see substantive changes. In the full report, which I'll have by the end of the year, you will be able to see the numbers, that show wood did increase. It wasn't from wood that came down from upstream. It was wood that beavers actually chewed and felled into the stream. So wood quantity did increase. There were debris accumulations on the structures that were put into the channel. So the amount of overhead cover did actually increase, both with riparian shade and some of the willow plantings that are shown in the bottom right. in the photo. Oops. So for substrate, did we reduce the amount of fine sediment? Yes, there was more gravel evident. It's likely a result of structures that create places for this fine sediment to drop out and then gravel to accumulate on the edges. And the photo to the top right there shows some gravel bars that have formed as a result of the wood being placed in the channel. And then you have pools formed adjacent to these pieces of wood. Pool quantity and quality. Did we increase the number of pools, the size of pools, and the complexity of pools, since they are a critical component for rearing fish? And basically, as I mentioned before, the pool quantity doubled in Reach 2. So we basically added to the amount of suitable rearing habitat that these fish can utilize. Next slide. And the beavers are working hard to create additional stillwater habitat as they build upon the structures that were placed in 2018. These stillwater habitats create ideal conditions for rearing juvenile fish, particularly coho. And you typically find cooler water flowing out of beaver ponds, and they allow for additional filtering of stormwater coming into the lower reach of Carly Creek. So the fish part of things, what did we find in terms of fish? The results are shown in the table. The rows are focused on are in blue, and they show the number of juvenile coho, chinook, steelhead, trout, and lamprey that were found. The type of fish sampling that we did conduct doesn't allow for estimating the actual number of fish present, both conditions in the creek, the methods that were allowed by the permit, and sampling limited our ability to determine actual abundance. It's a snapshot in time. It does inform us of the potential for rearing and even spawning by salmon, steelhead, and trout. I'll mention why in just a second. We did not see many salmonids 2 years after the project was completed. And this could be a result of many factors. Both conditions during spring and fall were challenging for sampling. The water was pretty turbid, so sampling efficiency was not very good. The number of juvenile chinook was interesting since there is no spawning habitat for chinook salmon in or near Carly Creek. These fish had to come from outside of Carly Creek and very likely could have come from upstream of the hydroelectric projects. Sampling conducted last spring did document a significant number of juvenile salmonids. Coho salmon were relatively abundant in the creek and pool below the culvert between Reach 2 and 3. And I say below the culvert because we found very few migratory fish above the culvert, and that was an indicator of potentially a passage barrier. Juvenile steelhead trout fry were documented in the creek below a riffle where it appeared that steelhead or trout could have spawned. And it's very rare that we find fish that are so small that they likely did not migrate into the stream. So it is pretty good evidence that steelhead potentially spawned in Carly Creek. Now it's the potential that they were cutthroat trout or rainbow, but we haven't found cutthroat or rainbow adults in the stream. So I'm just assuming that it was steelhead that spawned, which is very nice to see in a tributary like this. Again, the fall sampling didn't document as many fish as spring due to conditions in the creek that may have restricted access. And these are some of the structures that were created in the project in 2018 that are creating what would be a small dam in the stream that is high enough that juvenile fish might not be able to navigate. And again, few migratory fish were documented upstream of the culvert on the abandoned road. Next slide. Some recommendations that I have based on the study was one, to remove the culvert on the gravel road near the upper end of the project site. Another is to cut the beaver dam analog posts to 1 foot above the stream bed to reduce risk of developing these seasonal fish passage issues. The piles that are put in are probably 3 or 4 feet above the stream bed, which means that they can build debris behind them up to that height, which can create a barrier to fish. From a water quality perspective, consider protecting the larger riparian trees from beaver activity because they are beginning to be felled, which is removing some of the remaining riparian shade in the upper end of Reach 2. And then for water quality, consider stormwater protection actions in the watershed that's not supported by the stormwater treatment ponds. A good portion of this watershed does come, through an area that doesn't flow through the treatment pond. So I believe Wes is looking at working with many of these landowners, but it's something to be aware of that portion of this watershed isn't afforded the protections that come through that treatment wetland. Okay, next slide. So this slide shows an aerial photo of the mouth of Carly Creek, and it's really interesting to see this because it shows how Carly Creek is contributing again substrate in the form of gravel to the Clackamas River, and this is where fish will again benefit from that by potentially using that as spawning. Winter steelhead do spawn in this reach of the Clackamas River, so that's pretty neat thing to see. All right, well, thank you very much, and I'll take any questions.
I don't see anything in the chat.
Jim's got his hand raised.
Hi, Todd. Thanks for the presentation. It's looking good over there. I've got a question for you. It shows, your sampling table of fish shows that your non-native fish have gone down in terms of sampling. It's not a lot of fish, but it's showing this go down. Have you done any temperature monitoring associated with this?
That's a good question. I took temperatures when we did our sampling, but the more longer term, I think temperature monitoring is being conducted by Wes. I'm not sure if they're doing that in Carly Creek downstream of the treatment wetland, but my guess is, and this is what guessing from what's happening there with the beaver activity, is that the water that I documented as being cool is maintaining, cool enough temperatures through summer months, but apparently it is warm enough to support, some of those non-native fish. The number did go down. So what I'm hoping is that it reflects that temperature benefit, that it's no longer as conducive for those non-native fish. But yeah, I apologize that I bypassed that in the presentation, because it is important to recognize that non-native fish are also present in many of these streams, and they can impact our rearing juvenile fish too. So
yeah, thanks. That was the same thing that I was kind of thinking about. Is the temperature impacting, maybe being less conducive for some of those non-native fish? And I think that's an important part of the study if that's what's really happening. Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, Todd, I had a quick question. Fantastic presentation. But what are some ways to protect the trees to the beavers?
Well, I've even seen cases where you put pretty extensive fencing around the trees individually, and they'll even kind of work around those. But that's kind of when you get to a situation where they're trying to cut down about a 30-inch diameter cottonwood right now.
Wow.
That's pretty aggressive beaver activity. So that's kind of why I recommend to try to maintain those large trees that you do have left. And then some of the younger ones that are kind of reaching a size, those need to be protected too, because they're the ones that are going to provide that real shade to the stream.
Interesting.
I had a question as well, and hopefully it doesn't show my naivety, but you showed a picture of fish ladders, and as a kid, I always grew up being told that fish ladders were actually helpful and allowed the fish to go upstream and downstream of dams. And it kind of the way you framed it, it sounds like maybe that thinking has changed over the decades. Could you talk to that at all?
Yeah, well, many of the ladders that are in place today are pretty old. So, you know, they were constructed, like in the case of Rivermill, it was back in 1920. So the design for it didn't consider all species of fish or all sizes of fish or the conditions that they created kind of within the ladder. So most old ladders are too small. So the fish really can't find where they need to jump from box to box. So new ladders are constructed, you know, far better than they used to be, and they're far more efficient at passing fish upstream because they've tested it out, and it's been proven that the larger boxes, say, you know, allow these fish to migrate when they want to migrate and doesn't cause delay. Good question.
Thank you. It looks like Renee, you've got your hand up.
Yes, hi. Hi, Todd. Thank you. Great presentation. I'm glad to hear that Carly Creek improvements are actually making positive results to the habitat. My question actually might be for somebody from WES as opposed to you, but one of your recommendations was to do more stormwater management in areas surrounding Carly Creek. And I'm wondering, WES folks, are there any plans for any further projects in that area?
I can answer that question, Renee. I think in a couple ways. One, we do have in our CIP as part of our storm system master plan, one other potential project further up. Not necessarily, it's a portion of the Carly Basin, but it's near the Sahali Golf Course where we have a bunch of land up there that was once cited for another stormwater sort of treatment wetland, a lot like Carly, that could peel off flows from that really intensely developed area, including highways and stuff. Some of that we directed that collection system to Carly, but there is a little bit of the basin that could be treated there. Where at this point we're just sort of in a holding pattern on that project. We still own the land, and we still have those designs for that treatment wetland. So that's something that we might do. The other area I'd say our focus on the Carly Basin continues to be on private and public storm system maintenance and on pollution prevention activities with the industries and commercial sites in that area. We know the private storm systems need to be properly maintained and sometimes completely overhauled in order to work, and that's a big part of the solution. We know we can't do everything at Carly itself. It's not the only part of the solution is to treat it at the end. So we do a lot of inspections of commercial and industrial sites and make sure their storm systems are functioning, and if they have any sort of pollution prevention activities that they could do, we make sure that they do those. I think you can actually see evidence of that in the basin. I think I had said to Todd the other day when we were talking about this presentation that there's a facility, a stormwater facility that's right at the corner of 120th and Caps Road that was desperately in need of overhaul, and we worked with the property owner to completely remove sediment and replant that facility. I just saw it the other day. It looks great, but that's work that we require them to do. And I think that the third piece that I would mention is also, you know, we recently updated our stormwater design standards for any new development and, more importantly, redevelopment of land throughout our service district. So as sites develop, they have to build stormwater management systems that are going to function much better than they have in the past. And sites that redevelop, if a site in our service district replaces more than 5,000 square feet of impervious area, they have to provide stormwater management for that area up to today's standards, so we can slowly turn back the hands of time as sites redevelop, which that's happening quite a bit in the Carly watershed. So that's our general approach there.
Right. Well, I was going to say this lunch and learn was a little different in that we usually have a Wes staff present. And so I wanted to make sure that we gave Wes an opportunity to comment on that. But I think maybe, Ron, you did a very nice job right there summing this up.
Yeah, I mean, I can say more, Chris, if you'd like.
Sure. Yeah.
But one, I'm thankful
Please
I
do.
didn't have to do another presentation. So, and Todd knocked it out of the park. So I'm really very much appreciate Todd's time and his work on the site. I think first and foremost, want to recognize Gail Shalom, who continues to be our manager of the site and helping us be good stewards, because we know the work wasn't done as soon as we finished construction. There's a lot more to do there. And Gail's on a much deserved vacation, so she couldn't be here today, but I want to make sure that we recognize her in her work. Yeah, we continue to be proud of the work that we did at Carly Creek, both with the treatment wetland and the work on the channel itself, and its ability to its ongoing performance to improve water quality and habitat, and are beyond that thrilled, I think, to see that the stream restoration work that we did, that those elements are supporting fish recovery in the basin. That warms our hearts for sure. And I think we're headed in a good direction. Our monitoring work at the site will continue. We continue to monitor water quality, including some temperature stuff. And I can talk to Chris Desiderati, who's on this call, to see if we have any temperature data that we can send around to folks if they're interested in. We also plan to remove the culvert that Todd talked about. I already have Gail looking at some potential funding sources for that. It's not a difficult project to do. We've left it in place really because, it's important for accessing the site, but that importance is getting less and less meaningful over time, and that's not a difficult project to do. So we're certainly going to roll that thing out of there. And we did a bunch of restoration work above that culvert that we'd really like for Todd to start finding fish in. So that is certainly on our list, and we'll make sure that we address Todd's other insightful recommendations around the logjam structures. We want to make sure they're really doing everything they can do for us and not cause any issues. As I said, this basin is still really a focus of other elements of the stormwater management work that we do, and that's not stopping anytime soon. So we'll continue to work there. And again, this is not the only restoration work Wes has done in the basin, and certainly not the only restoration work that we continue to do. As folks know, we did a major project on Rock Creek, which is just a little further upstream. We've really seen a lot of benefit to, we think, fish populations in that channel, or in that stream channel. We are getting a lot closer to doing our Three Creeks project right by the Clackamas Town Center area for Scott Creek and Phillips Creek and Dean Creek, and that project should go to construction next year. Our floodplain and channel restoration there, which would be great. And we're also now have under a construction contract our restoration work in the Upper Kellogg Basin, where we're trying to address some chronic drainage issues because it's a really flat, wet basin, but we're also making improvements to the stream channel and putting wood in and making alcoves and things up there. So, Carly Creek is a piece of the puzzle, and we continue to do the work that we think we need to do and are invested in continuing to make watersheds healthy. So I appreciate the opportunity to wrap up. Thanks, Chris.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Ron. And thank you, Todd. I think maybe that's a wrap for today. If you do have any feedback, comments, or questions after this ends, I might suggest responding to the email that Chris had sent out with the link to this, or I'm sure if you have an email contact at Wes, I'm sure they can get that sent to the right folks and we can get your questions answered. And I believe, Chris, you end up posting this recording to the Wes website. Is that correct?
Yes, for sure. Shortly.
All right. Very good. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Todd. This was a great presentation. It's really wonderful to see how Carly Creek continues to mature over the years.
Thank you, Todd.
Mhm.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Wes.